The sitting is resumed. Senator Monroe Knight, Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we've had a deliberation in this Senate today on a number of important bills. We've just come before the lunch period where we had significant discussions on the issue of water in the context of the 3000 Spring Act, and we would have explored the notion of whether or not Barbados was water scarce, whether it was water stress, and we touched a little bit on what is it that we need to do in order to be able to manage our water resources more effectively, Mr. President, to ensure that we can deliver water for the population. Now, Mr. President, as well, you would have heard me earlier in this chamber speak to the issue of Mission Barbados and the 6 missions that were declared in the context of the agreement and consensus reached in the social partnership around Mission Barbados. And one of those missions, Mr. President, that I would have alluded to previously was the issue of water security. Water security. And the recognition of that as a challenge and also as one of the critical mission objectives that Barbados needs to work on was born out of a recognition that for a government, and particularly in the context of a small island developing state, provision of water to its citizens is fundamental. It is a right for people to be able to have clean water. It is one of the reasons that it is part of the SDG framework, SDG 6, because, again, there's the recognition that it is a threat to life and livelihood. Mr. President, in fact, globally, it is suggested or it is estimated that access to water is so significant that it accounts for the leading cause of death of children under the age of 5, the lack of access to water and to clean water. And moreover, Mr. President, 84 million people lack access to drinking water. In fact, Mr. President, some would suggest that the issue of climate change is really a challenge of access to water. So fundamental the issues and the interconnections are that people are aligning climate change and the access to water as critical crises that we are facing. And we say that, Mr. President, so we would understand that as a country that is on the front line of the climate crisis, that issues of access to water now become fundamental for us as a small island developing state. But the issue, Mr. President, is complex and it is nuanced. I want to say to you, Mr. President, I'll be very honest, that I was biting at the chomp just a little bit to jump in when we were having the previous discussions in this honourable chamber. And again, the discussions about whether or not Barbados is water scarce and the poor management. But I recognize that we need to have a full conversation to be able to appreciate all of the nuances. Mr. President, it's like those of us who study the Bible. We understand that you cannot have a literal translation of the text. You need to be able to compare various versions. You need to be able to understand the historical context in which what you are reading took place, and then you need to be able to do the necessary analysis in order to be able to exegete the word. And this discussion, the discussion that we've had earlier, is one in which we cannot just call numbers, we cannot just do the simple math and the multiplication, rainfall, and this is how big Barbados is, and multiply it, and then come to the conclusion that we're not water scarce, and then come to the conclusion that the issue is just about management, Mr. President. Yeah, Mr. President. I want to be able to say, Mr. President, that we step back and look at the issues in terms of where we are in terms of our water usage, and the challenges that we would face. So, Mr. President, the note that water scarcity is defined as the lack of fresh water resources to meet standard water demand. The lack of fresh water resources to meet standard water demand. Water stress, on the other hand, refers to the ability or lack thereof to meet human and ecological demand for water. So if we are saying that we are water stressed, we're also saying that we don't have sufficient resources in order to meet the needs of the society, yeah? And those needs, Mr. President, are again, our human needs, but also as well, water is critical as well for economic growth. How do we grow construction? How do we grow agriculture? How do we grow manufacturing if we do not have access to water, if we cannot meet the demand? So that we are talking about a significant issue in the context of looking at water, and particularly in the context of this discussion about water reuse. Because again, it is on the one hand, that human need about our health to make sure that we have access to clean water, but on the other hand as well, our need to be able to grow, to be able to expand our economy, and essentially to develop. So that is why, Mr. President, that people talk about this notion of access to water as being the key crisis that we are all facing, given our current context. So, Mr. President, we note that Barbados has few streams and rivers above ground. Remember, water scarcity is that lack of fresh water. Huh? And so that most fresh water is sourced from abstraction of underground aquifers and pumping beneath the island. Mr. President, we've moved from a situation in which annually, and this is taken from the Barbados Water Authority figures, where in the early 1940s or so, we used to have about 60 inches of rainfall per annum. Now, within the last perhaps 10, 20 years, we are averaging between 58 to 56 inches of water. But again, we cannot necessarily quote these figures without the appropriate context, as I said before. Because just beyond the rainfall amounts as well, Mr. President, we ought to note that the rainy season has shifted and become even more compressed, with rain starting later. So because of climate change, Mr. President, we are getting less rainfall. So even when we talk about what is the average expected, we have to put that in one column and then put the impact of climate change in another. What is it that we would normally expect to get in the context of rainfall on an average, and then the impact of climate change and what that means in terms of what it is that we can actually expect. So we have that. We have the impact of climate change, so we know that the rainfall amounts are declining. The rainy season has shifted, so we're getting less water. And again, Mr. President, we would have talked about the drought conditions that we have been experiencing, have had experienced for a number of years. This has meant that we now have more unpredictable rains, longer dry seasons, and more stress on the vegetation. And then we also have more intense rainfall events leading to less infiltration and more flooding. Because oftentimes people think we have real intense rain, so where's all this rain going? But we also have as well, Mr. President, a high level of runoff that happens, so we're not always able to capture all of that water. And I want to say, Mr. President, importantly, it is impossible to capture every single drop of water. I don't know, and I invite any of the honourable members here to indicate to me any country that's in it, they have 100% in terms of being able to capture all of the rainfall water. And in fact, Mr. President, I am informed by the Barbados Water Authority that it's perhaps not good to even capture all. Because when we have that runoff that goes into the sea, it creates a barrier that prevents saline intrusion. If we don't have that runoff, if we seek to capture all of that, what we would have is saline incursion, which means then that our potable water then become more salty, yeah, and affect our drinking, affect our ability to drink the water because it's going to be so salty. So that there is even value in not capturing, Mr. President, all of the water because that itself has a purpose. And that is important, to remember as well. I've also been informed, Mr. President, that we lose about 60% of our water to what is called evapotranspiration, which, as I understand it, is the natural process of evaporation that happens in the context of water. So again, Mr. President, I'm pointing to the fact that we have challenges, but those challenges should not allow us to obscure the fact that we do have a scarcity on our hands in terms of fresh groundwater, which makes this country a water-scarce country. I also want to suggest, Mr. President, that perhaps part of the challenge, again, is the recognition, or perhaps the lack of recognition, that when we talk about water scarcity, that the measure, Mr. President, of water scarcity is actually water stress. There is actually, I'm looking for it here now, how we measure that water scarcity is based on a Falcon Mark water stress indicator, Mr. President. So that sometimes the notion of water scarcity and water stress, can be used interchangeably because, again, the fact that we measure water scarcity by this measurement of water stress. Mr. President, I want to note as well that based on the figures, that again, we are doing, Mr. President, I will not say that we are where we need to be. We are far from it. There's much work that has to be done. But based on the figures provided from the Barbados Water Authority, it suggests that the total abstractions from the available groundwater resources during an average rainfall year exceed 98% of available renewable water resources. So we are abstracting, Mr. President, the large majority of available water resources. But even as we abstract that, the question is it enough to meet demand? And Mr. President, I believe that is the challenge. Mr. President, I want to go further and to quote some additional statistics for you, just in terms of looking at some consumption patterns. So if we look at domestic usage, it suggests that the estimate for consumption is 30.60 million milliliters per year. At the commercial, it's 3.55 million milliliters per year. Statutory corporations, 1.59 million a year. Hotels, 1.47. Ships, 0.29. Irrigation, 4.90. And golf courses, 0.90. And industrial, 2.60. All of those million milliliters per year. So that we're seeing that the highest usage, Mr. President, of the consumption of water is happening at the level of, one, domestics. And what we're talking about domestics, our household usage. Our household usage of water as well. And then, Mr. President, we then have irrigation, which is happening within the context of the agricultural sector. So that there is, on the one hand, the fact that we have limited rainwater, limited freshwater resources, the fact that we cannot necessarily abstract all of that. So we have that amongst, and then as well we have these high usage. And where the issue of the water scarcity and even water stress comes in is the extent to which the available resources can meet the demand. Mr. President, if we were just planning for today, if we were just looking at what is happening in Barbados today, we can perhaps hold our hands up and say, okay, it looks fairly good. But we would not be a responsible government if we were doing policy for today. We have to be doing policy based on estimates for the future. What is our future population going to look like? What is our future industrial policy going to look like? We're talking about agricultural expansion, so it means even more water in relation to agriculture and commercial use if we want, again, to expand in those areas. So that the issue now of how we conserve, people have talked about rainwater harvesting, but importantly, how we use the available resources that we have is going to become extremely important, Mr. President. And that is why we are, as a government, introducing this water reuse bill. Now, this bill has been around for some time, so it's not necessarily that it's new. There's been a number of discussions, Mr. President. It's been introduced before, but we are consolidating and bringing this bill, Mr. President, because we believe that we are at a moment in which we need to be able to go forward if we are able to meet the challenges that we have. And again, Mr. President, I go back to that notion of a government that is mission-focused and the fact that we understand that we cannot continue to run away from the complex problems and challenges, but that we have to be able to face them, even in the context of doing, again, and introducing processes that are going to be new and may even be challenging, but that to not do them will be to our peril. And this government has had a history of doing the tough things, even in the context of water, Mr. President. We came in to the cries of those in the rural areas in St. John, who months and weeks would go and did not have water. And we said we will fix it in St. Joseph and St. John. We said we will fix it. Mr. President, we came in to feces all in the tourist belt, and we said we would fix it, Mr. President. We are not going to run from the challenges that are complex. And like I said, Mr. President, the issues of water, how we address it and how we address access is fundamental. But Mr. President, on the one hand, and I'm going to be very honest, we have, as I said before, the issues of that we do have that lack of fresh water from our resources and how we are able to extract that. But at the same time, we also recognize, Mr. President, that we have aging infrastructure. Everybody knows we have pipes that date back to the 1850s. We have some leakage in our distribution network. We have faulty mains, Mr. President. And all of this means then that, again, yes, we will lose some of that critical water resource that we need in order then to be able to meet needs. So if we have this compendium of challenges facing us, how best then do we seek to address the challenges, Mr. President, in a proactive way? And the government has been seeking to do that and introduce a number of measures and legislation in order to make sure that we address this. So again, this is not a one-shot piece of legislation, a one-shot approach, Mr. President, to dealing with the challenge, because we understand that it's complex and it is nuanced. Mr. President, we have introduced water and land use zoning, stormwater management and flood alleviation policies, ecosystem and nearshore water management, including under the coastal zone management as well. And, Mr. President, this piece of legislation in the context of water reuse, because that is also fundamental. The context for looking at the issue of water reuse means then that we will be able to put back, the estimate suggests 5 million gallons of additional water per day to agriculture and industry for secondary uses. 5 million gallons of water that we would lose using water, what is called water reclamation, which is another word again for water reuse, in order to make sure that we can harness that resource and put it back into use. And I want to say, Mr. President, to be very clear up front, because very often when we talk about these debates, when we talk about water and access to clean water and talking about water reuse, then people will begin to get a little bit concerned. So we are talking in this context about water not for drinking purposes when we talk about water reuse, but water that can be used, as I said before, for secondary purposes, water that can be used for irrigation. Mr. President, how much water do we think we just use washing our cars every day? I would like somebody to be able to measure that, because there are people who would daily be washing their cars, yeah? And they are using the same potable water that we then have to make use of for our domestic supply to cook with, Mr. President, to make sure that our babies, I don't have any, to make sure that the babies have, again, water for their milk and all of those things. They're using that same water, that same essential water, to be able, don't have any babies now, that same water to do things, again, like those of us who are into agriculture have already admitted, Mr. President, in this honorable chamber that I do not have a green thumb, but those who are interested to grow things and have gardens, etc., again, like I said, irrigation, and all of those things, Mr. President, even flushing the toilets, Mr. President. Those are things that then we can reuse the water to be able to satisfy those particular needs, while we, again, on the other hand, ensure that we have water for the essential things, Mr. President. And that is fundamentally what we are talking about here in the context of water reuse. So, Mr. President, and particularly in the context of this bill, we would note as well that we are seeking to establish oversight of the process through the establishment at 5 of a committee to be known as the Water Reuse Committee. And that is important. I want to suggest that this bill provides a framework for how we will seek to manage the water reuse process. We understand, Mr. President, that it requires a strong framework to make sure that there are protocols in place to make sure, Mr. President, we do not have contamination, to make sure that it is used for the purposes that it's supposed to be used. And that is where the focus is on creating a strong institutional framework for the management of the process. And so that within the context of the bill, it provides for the Water Reuse Committee to make sure that it makes recommendations to the minister on applications for a wastewater treatment permit, determine the suitability of the premises and structures on premises for wastewater treatment plants, to monitor, importantly, to monitor each permit holder to determine whether the permit holder is in compliance with the Act, to inquire in terms of complaints against the permit holder, and to make recommendations, Mr. President, in relation to any complaint around a permit holder, and also as well to the extent that the permits should be suspended or revoked in relation to wastewater treatment permits, Mr. President. So, importantly, I want to stress, Mr. President, that we understand that the introduction of the notion of water reuse is going to be something that, as a country, as a society, that we are all going to have to come to terms with as an essential facet of how we deal with our water resources. And one critical component of that is, of course, the need to make sure that the society understands and is educated and understands the multiple ways in which we can use this reuse water or reclaim water as an asset and as a benefit, Mr. President, for us in relation to our water uses. So that, Mr. President, we note as well that in the context even of water reuse, that it has some benefits even for agriculture, because the water that we are going to reuse, as I understand it, has some nitrates and other nutrients in it that are good for agricultural uses, yeah? So that it is not just only now, just that use of the extent to which we can add to our supply, but there's actually a benefit for agriculture in the context of this reuse water that we are using. Actually, Mr. President, we had signed on to a protocol concerning pollution from land-based sources and activity. And under that protocol, we undertook to make sure that we develop the standards, the practices, the plans, and measures for the prevention, reduction, and control of land-based pollution that will impact the marine environment. And the water reuse bill is also a key step in implementing that protocol. And importantly, as I stressed before, Mr. President, that whole notion of making sure that we have an institutional framework that allows us to carefully monitor and regulate the issuing of the permits and the water reuse framework is critical. And then in the context even of this protocols, we then have additional standards that we have agreed to in order to ensure, again, against issues of pollution and contamination. And that is extremely important for us as well. And actually, Mr. President, so going back to the agricultural impact, what the analysis suggests as well is that the wastewater with its nitrate and phosphate loading can serve the dual purpose of providing the irrigation water while also providing a nutrient source. So double benefits as well in the context of the reused water in order for us to be able to then see higher yields of production in the context of agriculture. And again, this is important. I want to say, Mr. President, that it is intended that the administration of this act will fall under the Ministry of Health and operationalized, like I was speaking before, by a cross-sectorial water reuse committee. And why does it fall under the context of the Ministry of Health? Because we understand that this is a health issue as well, that this is a health concern. And therefore, the Ministry of Health will be tasked in providing the leadership for the administration of the bill, but as well because we recognize that this is going to impact across various ministries and across various stakeholders, the intent is that we do have this multi-sectoral, cross-sectoral committee that will be established. And I want to stress here, Mr. President, because very often, again, we're accused of not necessarily embracing the full gamut and nuance of the measures and policies that are put in place. But in the context of this water reuse and the establishment of the committee, we've paid attention specifically to that nuance, and that's the reason, again, by making sure that we have this cross-sectoral water reuse committee. Importantly, there is already significant cooperation happening between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Environment as well. And as well, may I add, Mr. President, as well, the Ministry of Public Works, and particularly where it involves the Barbados Water Authority as well. So already there is collaboration and discussion. We recognize that this is also going to involve testing, so it means then that we have to work with laboratories, etc. And Mr. President, we are working to make sure that we have those conversations, that we do get the necessary buy-in and bring people on board to make sure that we have the sufficient infrastructure for the administration of this water reuse. The intent, and I do want to stress again that in the context of this bill, that reclaimed water that we are talking about here is intended for non-potable uses. Mr. President, I cannot stress that enough. It is not intended for drinking. This is not water that we are giving back to people to drink. The intent is for non-potable uses, Mr. President. And again, we talk about some of those uses in the context of what we need to be able to replace the use of our current potable water with this reclaimed water. And I think, Mr. President, I would want to really call on Barbadians. And I hope that we're not deterred by this notion that we're not water scarce, you know, we have sufficient water, etc. Because it's important that people understand that we still need to be able to conserve. We still need to be able to conserve water, Mr. President. Just because we see that we are having heavy rainfalls now, as I said before, this should not obscure the fact that we may have heavy rainfall for 2-3 days and no rainfall for 2-3 weeks. And the extent to which that balances out, Mr. President, is then something that we have to then deal with. And I made the point before and reiterate it again, that we have to look not at today. We have to make sure that we are future-proofing, Mr. President. What is the analytics when it comes to climate change and its impact for the next 5-10 years, Mr. President? What does the water usage look like next 5-10 years? And the question that we must ask ourselves as a government, as citizens, is whether or not we want to be able to take the risk that we do nothing, that we don't act. And then, what will be the implications? Mr. President, I want to note, as I said, and I indicated previously, how the government, through various policy measures, have been trying to address various aspects of this issue. But also note as well that, again, under the Barbados Water Authority, that we have been attempting to make sure that we can attract grant funding to help deal with not only the issue of addressing the water scarcity, but also the infrastructure as well. As I talked about before, the old pipes, the leakage, etc. We understand that that is also critical to addressing the issue. So we are not here claiming, Mr. President, that this water reuse is intended to be the fix-all, that by implementing this water reuse policy, Mr. President, that we will have addressed the fundamental issue of access to water and how we should address it. That is not what this bill is attempting to do. We fully understand that this is one plank in the process, but we are also working on the other pillars. The Barbados Water Authority, through grant funding from the Global Environment Facility, and also as well through the Green Climate Fund, is seeking resources in order to repair mains, Mr. President, in order to ensure that we reduce leakage, in order to better measure what is called that non-revenue water, that water that is lost, Mr. President, again through leakage, etc., so that then we can be able to adapt and to see where it is that that leakage is occurring, what it is that needs to be repaired and replaced, Mr. President. So that itself is an ongoing program and body of work as well. We talked also as well about the issue of water harvesting, and that is also critical to the process and something that we need to be able to address. So as I said, Mr. President, multiple planks to this issue of access to water. It is complex, it is nuanced, Mr. President, and I hope that we are appreciating the complexity of the issue, but also as well appreciating that government, again, is trying to face it and fix it in the context of making sure that we can deal with the issue of water reuse and how we can ensure that we can at least make sure that we are able to use the water that is available. So the act that we have, the bill that we have before us, establishes a permitting system for the water reuse. It sets out a clear process for the production and the sale of the reclaimed water that is safe for the intended uses, non-potable, Mr. President. It establishes, as I said before, this water reuse committee. It provides guidelines, Mr. President, for the permitting process as well to be issued, and the creation as well and maintenance of a wastewater register as well is also a requirement under the bill. And therefore, Mr. President, it makes provision to make sure that we address the following issues: establishing a focal point to administer the bill, which, as I indicated before, is the Ministry of Health, so we know who has responsibility for addressing these issues. Establishing the committee with oversight for the permit process, providing for issuing of the wastewater treatment permit to operate, requiring, Mr. President, monitoring, inspecting, sampling of effluent, and determining compliance with issued wastewater treatment permits, investigation of complaints, and preparation as well of guidelines, Mr. President. So the bill provides for a framework, and we fully understand, Mr. President, this is going to be part of ongoing conversations and dialogue. This is, Mr. President, an act. We need to be able to have the guidelines developed, the regulations fully fleshed out, and that will involve ongoing conversations with key stakeholders as part of this. So this is not, and we're not saying, Mr. President, that after this passes, we open up and then permits will begin to be issued right away, and we'll have all of these permits circulating. That is not the case. We fully understand, as I keep saying, the complexity and the nuancing of the process, and we are also fully committed to continuing as well to be able to engage with the necessary stakeholders. Mr. President, I close by again reiterating the importance of this bill as a critical plank to addressing what is globally, Mr. President, this is not a Barbadian issue. This is not even a Caribbean issue. This is a global issue that is recognized as a critical threat facing humanity in the context of access to water. I stress, Mr. President, as a small island developing state, that we have to make every conscious effort that is focused and targeted to be able to address the issue for future generations. And that is our test, Mr. President. for future generations. That is the test of a good government, Mr. President. And that is what this water reuse, Mr. President, this water reuse bill is attempting to do. I'm obliged, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Moroni. Move the second reading.
Yes. Mr. President, I do not beg that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you very much. Any contributors to the debate? Senator Honourable.
Thank you, Mr. President. Subject that we dealt with a little bit earlier. I'll deal with a couple of other areas, if I might. First of all, I guess I would like to start out by saying that I have a document in front of me entitled The Government of Barbados State of the Environment Report 2000. Very, very informative document, Mr. President. And I'm very pleased to say that in the foreword of this document is delivered by none other than our Deputy President, Senator, the Honourable Elizabeth Thompson. In this document, 23 years now old, in the foreword, and if I might quote, it reads, "It is the government's wish that the report should serve as an accurate source of information to all citizens, as well as international interest. It's also designed to provide a platform on which future analysis can be built and a yardstick against which Barbados' stewardship in the area of environmental resource management can be objectively assessed." Excellent document, excellent lead into it. And I'm very pleased to say in section 5.4.1 on page 45, Mr. President, I would again like to quote, with your permission, the last paragraph of section 5.4.1, and the report says, "It is clear that Barbados' water demands exceed a sustainable yield. Under these circumstances, the risk of salt water intrusion into the aquifers due to over-abstraction constitutes a significant source of stress to the quality of the water supply." Mr. President, it would be reasonable to ask, why have I gone to this document from 23 years ago? It was published in 2001, so in fairness, maybe let's say it's 21 years old. I'm saying because this is not a new problem, Mr. President. This is a problem that has been recognized by previous governments, by previous parties, many different people. The problem hasn't changed, Mr. President. What is perhaps an issue with this is that we haven't done anything about it. I struggle with this, Mr. President. I struggle. I struggle, and the Honourable Senator, in referring to some comments I made earlier, seeks to belittle, in my estimation, the points that I made with regards to the reasonable capture of excess water on the surface and to look after our suck wells, as if I'm looking at this problem in a very flippant way. Mr. President, I'm not. I've thought about this and I've looked at it. And my points stand, regardless of what the Honourable Senator has sought to make some small other points against it. In any case, let me get to the substantive matter of this bill. I applaud the government in this bill. This is something that we have needed for a long time. We needed this since 1996, Mr. President, when, unfortunately, a regulation that originated in our Town and Country Planning Office required all houses, and if my recollection is correct, of 1,200 square feet or more to build a cistern for the collection of rainwater. 1,200 square feet, I remember, and it's a number of gallons per square foot of the roof. From 1996 until whenever this act comes to being and is implemented in its fullness, we have had all of this water that we were unable to use effectively. And repeatedly, the private sector, other government agencies have talked about it. And the problem was it was a lack of coordination between the Town TCPO office and the EPD. Because the EPD, the Environmental Protection Department, Mr. President, refused to allow the water to be used in the toilets, as this bill is now allowing us to do. So I applaud government in fixing this problem that was about since 1996. So I don't have a whole lot to say on here. I would like to address that the legislation refers to the committee that will deal with further regulations, and I would like to suggest that we want to be careful in over-regulating this matter. The grey water that is produced to be used in agriculture, we're going to need a building code. The plumbing side of it needs to be addressed so that we understand how we can take the water that we've collected from the roofs, and we can plumb that and use it into the toilets without having the possibility of contaminating the drinking water within the residents, etc. We need to understand that, so there's a lot of work, I think, Mr. President, that's going to need to be done after this part of it is done. But it is an excellent start. Let me repeat that. I think this is an excellent start in the right direction, and it corrects, and it does show some action on things that were talked about as far back as 2000. I would like to make one other suggestion before I conclude, Mr. President, which is that I would hope that in short order, this committee, having gone in this direction with this legislation, we could address how we could expand the storage of potable water at residences, commercial buildings, hotels, and the like. This addresses an expansion of how to use grey water. But had we, in 1996, instead addressed that TCPO regulation to a potable water supply, if you think of how many houses have been built since then, how many hotels or commercial buildings, if each of them had been required to have a potable water storage, the capacity for storage would not only rely on what the Barbados Water Authority could build, it would have also almost generically expanded, if I could call it that. So I do hope that this is a start to a continued focus on how do we store more water, how do we capture more water, how do we treat with agricultural land where we are capturing the water, all of those things. I hope that this is a start to it. And with those few words, Mr. President, as I say, I shall endorse the direction of this bill, and I am happy to support it, and I look forward to the other comments of my fellow senators. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Malado. Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me, and I have a few brief comments on the legislation or the draft legislation which has been presented to this honorable chamber. The bill says a bill to provide for the capture, collection, treatment, and reuse of wastewater for various purposes. I think, Mr. President, it is clear to me that the bill provides a legal framework for the use of wastewater for use in our country. It recognizes, in my view, that the use of wastewater will contribute to increasing the overall water supply, both for domestic and for agricultural use. Mr. President, the plans are clear. The mechanism for management is clear, with the provisions for the use of a multidisciplinary committee, a register of users, penalties, and appropriate administrative redress for contravention of the provisions of the bill. I would like to congratulate the government for its foresight in bringing this to the chamber and for seeking to address the issue of water and water management in our country. Mr. President, I have a few concerns related to the document which has been presented to us today. My first concern relates to page 21, section 24D, where the use of black water, there's caution on the use of black water for agricultural use. Page 21, section 24D. The use of black water for irrigation and treatment and edible crops, which are to be sold or otherwise supplied for human consumption. I think there's an important part of the bill that needs to be managed carefully, and I would advise that appropriate steps be taken to ensure that all food safety regulations that relate to the proper management of edible produce be taken into consideration when we speak of the use of wastewater. We have seen over the years, Mr. President, efforts which have been taken to remove from the market crops that have been contaminated by wastewater, by E. coli and other bacteria, causing gastrointestinal infections, disease, and health challenges in populations around the world. And therefore, it's important that we be careful and vigilant to ensure that we do not, in seeking to solve one problem, create another. Because it is important that where wastewater is used for edible crops, especially crops that are not being cooked, lettuce and other crops, leafy greens that are not cooked, but are used for salads, etc., are not treated with black water that can transmit diseases of the gastrointestinal type. And so I would urge caution, vigilance in ensuring that we adhere to appropriate food safety standards and procedures in the use of this kind of water for edible crops. That's my first comment, Mr. President. My second comment relates to section 26(1)(d). 26(1)(d), where we speak to administrative penalties. In that section, Mr. President, it's indicated that, if I can find it, in that section it's indicated that there will be an administrative penalty, administrative penalty of $5,000 for the contravention of certain provisions of the bill. Now, it's not clear to me, Mr. President, the difference between contravention and an offense. There is a penalty for an offense, and there's penalty for contravention. And there's a difference between the penalty for the offense and the penalty for contravention. And it's not clear to me what's the difference in this particular case. It also says that the minister, quote, the minister may, subject to subsection 4, impose on the permit holder an administrative penalty of $5,000. And then on the next page, it says in section 6, page 23, section 6, a person who is in receipt of an administrative penalty shall pay the amount of the penalty to the minister and comply with any additional requirements contained in the notice on or before the date specified in the notice. Again, Mr. President, it's not clear to me what mechanisms exist in terms of paying to the minister an administrative penalty. I assume that there are appropriate administrative procedures in place for the payment of fines, where those fines contravene the law. But I'm concerned that here in this particular document, there's room for an administrative penalty to be paid to the minister. Mr. President, this is not clear to me as to how this will be managed, who will supervise it, how will it be paid, what receipt will be provided, what redress the person who has to pay this administrative penalty may have if the person believes that they have not been fairly treated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I believe, Mr. President, with all due respect, that this requires some clarification as to how an administrative penalty in the context of this particular legislation will be managed, as opposed to a contravention of the legislation where a fine is in fact imposed. Other than these concerns, Mr. President, I have no difficulty with the bill as presented. I think it opens an opportunity for us to be more efficient in the use of the water resources of the country. And I believe that going forward, we will be able to take advantage of available water in a more effective way and therefore contribute to our water sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Bradford. The speakers, please. Senator Maynard.
I too will be brief again, Mr. President. Mr. President, this bill is long overdue. And I concur with Senator Malalou that a lot of people's money has been spent and there's been a lot of dengue in this country and deaths because people were never told or educated, and we still haven't done it, about the use and the purpose of having a cistern as a compulsory requirement when your house is over, I think it's 1,250 square feet, but I stand corrected. Mr. President, there's even in the dry season, unlike in those cisterns where the person actually uses the water, there are many cisterns in this country that are still filled with water that provides a breeding source for mosquitoes. And the question about potable water storage makes good sense because we have seen what happens when the power goes off in areas and pumping stations do not have power, and therefore the water that's in the reservoir cannot be pumped. But even if you had a potable water source and you cannot pump it unless it has gravity feed, you may have problems accessing it. So there has to be a lot of thought given to the engineering aspect, simple as it may seem, when we advise people on potable water storage. I don't know what the mathematical permutation is, but it would be a large volume of water if every house in Barbados had potable water storage, an exceptionally large. And our reserve of potable water would be massive. I wondered, Mr. President, whether there could be an incentive for people to install, a tax-deductible incentive for persons to install potable water tanks. Now, Mr. President, we've stood here today and debated two important bits of legislation related to water. But no one has dared to talk about the sewage that goes into the ground. What this legislation might do is that it might reduce the impact by reducing the volume of some of that sewage that goes into the ground. If it is applied to future communities where, I suppose, in areas like new developments like the Hope Project, in the same way that you could have, in the same way, Mr. President, you could possibly have photovoltaic electricity generation, one may be able to look at secondary sewage treatment, Mr. President, and the water can go into a communal pond to fund the next door plantation. So who knows what we can do with it if we think right through it. But what it will demand, Mr. President, is energy. It will demand energy, Mr. President, and energy is very expensive. So in the same vein that we speak about potable water, and 70% of the water, 7% of the cost is energy, we will probably have to apply some brains and work out how much it will cost us to do all of this. But it will cost energy, and it will cost money. And it will not be cheap. I do not know if it will be cheaper than desalination. I am not willing to hazard a guess, but maybe someone will tell us. Someone must have thought about it. Now, Mr. President, the world is changing, and what used to be functions solely of government are becoming the responsibilities of individuals and communities. But we have to remember, Mr. President, that if we want to have some of the responsibilities of government passed back to the community, the taxes that we pay the government for those functions will have to be looked at. So I cannot be paying a garbage and sewage tax, Mr. President, for treating my sewage when somebody else is now doing it and making money on it. So there has to be considerations for, well, if you are paying someone to collect it and somebody else is processing it and selling it back, well, do I have any share in that ownership? Because I'm paying a tax every month for that process. I just throw that out there because it is all about money. Because these processes that we've outlined here will all cost money. I noticed, Mr. President, very interestingly, that as Senator Brathwaite did, that the fee is paid to the minister. I have not seen that or a penalty in any other legislation, and someone can tell me whether it's meant to be so or not. And I'm a little bit surprised, since I didn't have time to read the bill before today or get any clarification on it. Now, there are lots of details that are left to work out, Mr. President. The section of the bill that speaks to the uses of grey water, Mr. President, one could almost add on anything other than potable. And there are functions that happen in the community, like construction, where large volumes of water are used, and most of that water tends to be potable water. And we are paying top dollar for potable water. Senator Malalu says that it is still cheaper than in some other parts of the world. And maybe it is, but for a lot of people in this country, it is an expense. Mr. President, if all of these things that we wish to do with the water that we have to recover are done, it might ease the burden somewhat on the demand for water for things other than potable purposes. Because at present, the only source of water we have is potable water, except in the places where we have irrigation wells. But what we must not do, Mr. President, what we must not do is lose sight of what will happen, as has happened before, to our reefs and to our streets when things go wrong. And I feel, Mr. President, that we only had maybe one sewage treatment plant or two, and we were not able to manage them at some points in time. And design and relevance is everything. And I don't know the details, Mr. President, that we have not seen any of what will be the size of these plants that you can apply for, what regulations will control them. But we have to have a plan for mitigation, Mr. President. It's one thing having 2 national plants go down, but when you have lots of small plants, you have to have the manpower to truly monitor them, Mr. President. Because when they go wrong, and they will go wrong, we have to have the trained manpower to fix them and the resources to clean up, literally, the problems that it will cause. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Miller. Senator Dr. Hayne.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me this afternoon. I would like to contribute on this debate related to the water reuse bill, and I listened intently to the contributions of my colleagues. I especially appreciated Senator Dr. Brathwaite's take, particularly as it related to the angle as it related to health, particularly where he spoke to concerns related to the types of fruits and vegetables that tend not to be cooked before consumption. But I also wanted to highlight that this is one of the reasons that this government took the position that it was going to transfer the responsibility for the operationalization of this act from the Ministry of the Environment to the Ministry of Health. And if you take a look at the composition of the Water Reuse Committee, it's actually chaired by the Minister of Health or one of his nominees, and also has representation from the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Agricultural Officer, and a number of other technocrats that will work on specifying the terms of what types of water require which specific sets of treatment. And I would like to say further to this that I think it's one of the reasons why it's important that wherever possible, we should be allowed to see the regulations that should accompany these bills, so that when we come to debate, that we really have a full picture of what's being presented. But I did appreciate the point that you made. I wanted to actually open my contribution by saying I went to a restaurant recently, and typically when they're offering you water, you'll hear, would you like sparkling water, would you like still water, or would you like Bajan's Finest? And I thought to myself, why would we be using Bajan's Finest to hose down our driveways, to wash our cars, to wet the hedge, to wet the lawn? So I think that this move, while it speaks more or less to the more commercial or industrial aspects of water reuse, I do look forward to the day where householders can be encouraged to participate on a wider level, because we all understand the value of water. Water is the kind of resource, it covers over 70% of the planet. We know that no life form on Earth can survive without water. But here we are using it in a way sometimes that doesn't show that we really appreciate its value. And in the context of a water scarce country, as it's been established that Barbados in fact is, being the 15th most water scarce country on the planet, we have a responsibility to be better stewards of this rare but valuable resource. And I want to commend everyone who had a role in bringing this bill before us, and I look forward to its operationalization. Why am I struggling with this word today? In my research, I found that there were actually 16 different wastewater treatment plants, or regardless of whether large or smaller scale, already in existence. And of those, 18 are already practicing water reuse. I believe that the Environmental Protection Department had a role in terms of the monitoring, but this kind of formalizes it a bit more. And I think that the bill really tried to cover, but once again, I look forward to seeing the regulations that will follow. It's expected to add an additional 5 million gallons to our water supply, and this is something that's critical. Right now, we are living in drought conditions. We all know that a prohibition was set out from April 24th to extend to the 30th of June of this year, based on recommendations from the Caribbean Association for Meteorology and Hydrology. They said that we're basically going back through an El Nino phenomenon. The World Meteorological Organization also recently concluded a meeting where they released a press document that indicated that for the first time within the next 5 years, the planet is expected to get to temperatures that surpass the 1.5 degrees Celsius. For the first time, there's a 66% chance that the global temperatures will surpass 1.5 for the first time compared to pre-industrial levels. And that's the level that we said was the point of no return. So here we have a situation where we're experiencing drought conditions. Our aquifers aren't having the opportunity to recharge. That's compounded by our climate reality, where the oceans are getting hotter, and we are seeing less rainfall. We have a critical situation, and I think that what we're doing here is going to better put Barbados in a position where we can manage resource in order to support not only livelihoods, but support the industries that we want to see transform in the next few years. I had a chance to take a look at the estimates related to agriculture. I noted that the Ministry of Agriculture has made a significant investment in water harvesting. Their ministry specifically has established water harvesting facilities at River that has a 6 million gallon capacity, at Layers with a 21 million gallon capacity, Haggett's with a 4 million gallon capacity, Bawden's with 2 different 3 and 4 million capacity water harvesting plants. And I just wanted to say that we are dealing with our water scarce situation in a multiplicity of ways. We are not only dealing with water use, we're dealing with water harvesting. In addition, we understand that the Green Climate Fund has invested an $80 million grant that will be put towards upgrading our mains in terms of upgrading our reservoir systems. We know that there have been chronic issues plaguing the north of the island. Typically, this has been related to the aged infrastructure. The mains in some parts of the country are over 160 years old. You are sure to see a burst main most days of any week, but overall, we know that this is a very, very costly venture. It's going to be something that we will have to tackle over the longer term. It will take time, but we've already seen significant investment made. We no longer see people on the east of the island complaining. The Vineyard Water Augmentation Project has done significant benefit to the people on the East Coast. I actually have a member of staff who lives in St. John, and I remember her complaining about the road being dug up. So I said, is it a roadwork situation? It turns out it was actually that they were doing mains replacement in order to run water to supply her area. So I had to ask her, circle back and ask her, when last have you had issues related to your water supply? And not at all recently. So with the recognition that we are facing a challenge that has several different factors feeding in, whether it's our basal water supply and our groundwater supply being low, whether it's related to rising temperatures, or whether it's related to age infrastructure breaking down, and the fact that close to 40% of the water that's extracted from aquifers never actually makes it to our pipes. On the other side of it, we're trying at our best to invest and to conserve and to make sure that we can meet our needs. I am looking forward to seeing the regulations that will accompany this act, but overall, I think it's a fantastic move and it's consistent with the developmental and transformation plans that have been outlined for the country. Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hayes. Senator Harewood.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. President. This seems like a very familiar position. It seems as though I was standing sometime today representing an issue related to water. I don't know if it's deja vu, sir. But I am, however, thankful for the opportunity to make representation on this very revolutionary document in terms of the water use bill, sir. Sir, I want to begin by making mention of a document that I have in my possession. It is called the Barbados State of the Environment Report 2000, published by the United Nations Environment Program for the Ministry of Physical Development and the Environment for Barbados. And in her absence, sir, the Deputy President would have been the person who had a forward in this particular document as well. And I want to just mention quite briefly page 48 of this document, which spoke to, let me just pull it out very quickly, which spoke to a situation of scarcity, sir. It spoke to a situation of scarcity at that particular juncture. It spoke to the increasing demand with respect to water from the urban expansion, urban developments, and increasing demands in even the tourism sector as well, sir. I would take the point for sure that this bill, based on the time frame between 2000 and now, is long in coming, but I want us to focus on the fact that this bill is here, sir. I want us to focus on the fact that, irrespective of how long it took, that this government has taken the decision to get us to this point, and that it has been a course of ups and downs with regard to establishing the technical aspects of this bill. But nonetheless, sir, I want to commend this government for getting us here in 2023, sir. Sir, I also want to address the point of regulations. And whereas I understand and I appreciate the notion that we should be careful to not over-regulate, we are dealing with water, sir. And we're dealing with the potential of non-potable water in a parallel network, not the same network, in a parallel network with potable water. So I want to caution on the flip side, sir, that we do not under-regulate, when it comes to having substances of a non-potable nature being established in the same environment as a substance in a potable nature, and any risk of cross-contamination that would hold the entire system very much at risk, or putting health and lives at risk, sir. So I understand that we may not want to over-regulate, but this is something that has implications on the lives of people if not done correctly, and we should not under-regulate as well, sir. Sir, I want to say that it was also mentioned with respect to the use of black water in the agricultural sector, and I want to echo the sentiments of Senator Haynes in terms of, Senator Dr. Haynes, sorry, in terms of having the regulations before us to give further information or further insight. I do know, sir, that this particular bill, if it becomes an act, sir, we'll have regulations that speaks to the classification of water, sir, so that we understand fully well that water is not water, and non-potable water is not non-potable water. Suffice it to say, as I have made representation in a different form, the same ecological constructs of water being used for lettuce is not the same as the water we use for a potato, given the fact that the end process, one is normally cooked for those persons who cook the potatoes before they eat them, sir, is different from lettuce, which can be basically pulled from the ground and consumed right away. So we do understand that the use of black water in this particular case may not necessarily be seen within the light of the health provisions, but I want to give the assurance that those regulations and those specifications are definitely being considered at the level of the regulations as well, sir. Sir, this has been a very non-contentious debate, so I really want to point to some opportunities that this offers, sir. And this is a revolutionary bill. When I've spent a number of times in Grenada and in Carriacou in particular, and there's a season called Let Go season. And that is a season where, essentially dry season, you basically let go all the livestock you have. So in Grenada, during the dry season, you go over there, in Carriacou in particular, sorry, when you go over in Carriacou, you see sheep, goats, few cows roaming the street all over the place, sir. And persons wonder why. And this is because the farmers, the persons who own these animals, don't have water at home. So they allow them to roam and forage. I don't know what is the mechanism that they use, but it seems as though every person gets their animal back to them. Every single person. There's never a dispute with respect to whose sheep that is or whose cow that is. And sir, that is the nature of the circumstance that we are facing here in Barbados. It may not be the situation we're facing, but we must look at those extreme parameters. In Petite Martinique, it is even worse, sir. We must look at those extreme circumstances that we do not want to get to. And that is why we are looking at water reuse. Water reuse, sir. We have water harvesting in the water system. We have water treatment and storage. We have water distribution, and water reuse plugs that gap in terms of water redistribution. So the opportunity, sir, selling. Now allow my mind to wander a bit here, sir, but I'm thinking for the commercial sector, the private sector, this is a significant opportunity to generate economic activity where it has not perhaps been thought of, and I wouldn't necessarily take credit or commission for the particular suggestion I'm going to make, but it offers opportunities, sir, for the commercial sector in Barbados to come on board for economic purposes. Picture, sir, down Fontebelle, where we have entities such as Hansel Innes Limited, located next to the cricket stadium, Kensington. Now imagine with all the roofing space that Hansel Innes has, imagine all the staff that Hansel Innes has, persons that consume water for different reasons throughout the day. And imagine, sir, if we had to install a treatment plant that met the specifications in alignment to this particular bill, and Hansel Innes decided that we have enough to run our plant to do what we do for non-potable purposes, non-potable water purposes, but we also have excess. It means now that Hansel Innes that entity could take the excess treated water for non-potable reasons, and with a network right next door, sell it to the Kensington Oval at a cheaper rate once they meet all the specifications for this, sir. So we have to be very innovative or think innovatively in terms of what this bill has to offer. It also offers the opportunity, sir, for upgrading the existing skills for plumbers, because now we're looking at dual plumbing. And there is a proof of concept with respect to this, sir. It is not going to be rocket science for our plumbers. We already have it existing by way of Coverley with this dual plumbing, a purple pipe, if some persons care to go up there and see the plant. Purple pipe really represents the treated water, and the white pipe for the potable water coming from the BWA service as well. It also offers opportunities, sir, and Senator Mayer made reference to the dependence on energy. It offers the opportunity now to integrate some of these systems with renewable energy solutions such as solar, sir. The pumps, they're solar water pumps we used in Grenada in 2014 under a climate change project from a company in Germany called Lawrence. It already exists. Most persons now across Africa are looking at the DC renewable energy systems, not the AC system, which is solar and inverter, but you're bypassing the inverter and getting the direct current from the solar panel straight into a battery, sir, a DC battery. And that saves up to 70% of the energy from the sun relative to what happens now with the regular AC systems, which is about 30% efficiency the most. So all of that means there are options out there, sir, to make this a sustainable system with respect to water reuse. We have the renewable energy, which will offer jobs for persons to train. We have the dual plumbing to enhance the skill sets of the plumbers, and also the most creative aspect of what I mentioned. I really would love for the private sector of Barbados to come on board and explore and exploit this water reuse bill for what it is, act for what it will be, in terms of looking in their direct vicinity to see how they can reuse their excess water, if they generate excess water, to bring some funds into their institution as well, sir. So, sir, I believe that the government of Barbados is moving in the right direction. This is a bill that surpasses most of the other similar legislation within the Eastern Caribbean that I've reviewed. Some of them don't even have this particular provision. They've spoken about it maybe 20 years or so back, similar to the report I mentioned. But we have taken the step today, sir, to make this vision a reality, sir. We've taken the first step towards the sustainability of our consumption patterns with respect to the water reuse bill. But, sir, I want to close on a line of caution, through you to all Barbadians, that the real elephant in the room is conservation. Conservation is the real serious aspect that needs to be addressed. So the government is doing its part, and the people of Barbados can do their part in terms of making the provisions for water reuse. But you can reuse water 20 times, and if you reuse it in a way that is wasteful, sir, you are hampering the overall effectiveness of the water network in Barbados. And that speaks to conservation and the efficiency of consumption as well, sir. It is something that we need to tackle along with this legislation, and that is an aspect that I'm pleased to say that the Barbados Water Authority is looking to move full speed ahead as it will roll out a program in the near future that will be communicated through the effective channels, sir. So water conservation is the next particular aspect that I would stick a pin to in terms of caution, but recognizing overall, sir, that we have to start someplace. And we've chosen today to start on water use. It is long in coming. I believe that this will lead the way for many other innovations in Barbados. I believe that it addresses some of the shortfalls within which we always speak of in terms of persons wasting water constantly. And even in the agricultural sector, sir, when we look at fisheries, perhaps one of the biggest uses of water in the agricultural sector in fisheries is washing on the boats. The boats are washed with potable water. Now imagine if we had to implement an on-plant system, which is possible at both the Bridgetown and Oistins markets, where the water being used is basically water that, one, they can use from the roof, yes, but they can use the water that the fish vendors use to clean the fish, which has to be potable water to meet phytosanitary standards. But currently it is run out to different storage areas. So, sir, I want to end by saying that this water use bill Yes, it speaks to the treatment of wastewater, but it offers significant economic opportunity and innovation throughout Barbados once implemented correctly, which we will do as a government, sir. So with those few words, sir, I would like to commend this bill and would like to offer my full support on behalf of all other senators on this side. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Harris. Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon. So, Mr. President, as with everyone else here, who's spoken so far, I do think this is very useful. I've learned a lot today. I've learned a lot here, and I also learned a lot outside of here. I do appreciate the assistance that was offered today so that we could engage with an expert in the area to try and better understand this bill. There are still questions that I have, and I expect that perhaps others, those in the public, may have some questions as well as to how this is going to function. So when we have access to this water, how is it getting to the places that it needs to get? Does this mean that we have to have a second set of piping that disrupts the roads? Do we have to dig up roads again, etc., to distribute this water across the island, whether it is for agriculture or other purposes, which are outside of eating, drinking, bathing, and so on? So this may be one question that people have about the implementation. There are some questions that I had as well as to what kinds of entities might be able to supply this water. So are we talking about the Barbados Water Authority alone? Would I be able to set up this kind of plant? I'm not quite certain. Is anyone who has an interest in this and who says, all right, I'm going to start collecting rainwater, would they then be able to apply for these permits? And as has been mentioned in here already, perhaps things like the regulations that would give us a sense of the cost of the permits and some of the things that people would have to do in order to attempt to do this would be useful. So what I note here is, and there is something that's troubling me a little bit about this, about speaking today, and I understand that sometimes things need to be done quickly. I understand that there is urgency at times, but I like to have more time to process and to do some background checking on my own and this sort of thing. But I knew that this looked familiar to me as well, familiar-ish. And that is because I had to go back. You know, sometimes you doubt yourself and you wonder, as Senator Harewood said, is this deja vu? But it isn't, because we actually were able, we had sight of this document, a version of the water reuse bill in March. But that version is different from this one. And some of the things that are different, I don't know why the changes were made, but that previous document contained 3 schedules. This one contains 1. One of those schedules had things such as the permit fees. It had a lot of other information about things like conflict of interest that should not pertain for those who will be doing some of the regulation and so on. So there are differences in these 2 versions of the bill that I don't have any information on as to what's the rationale behind the changes here. So what I'm trying to say here is that although this is useful, there are still some questions that I would love to have answered, and not just for my personal curiosity, because I am personally curious about it, but also for that of the public, so that, you know, when we see things happening, people complain, they're always digging up the roads, that people have an understanding that this is not You know, you've just replaced some old pipes, and people are asking, why is this road being dug up again? You have an understanding that this is connected to something that is of broader or wider import nationally in terms of dealing with our issues connected to water. And as I said, my other questions surrounding who can do this, what are the requirements to do this? Is this an emerging sector in the economy that people can get involved in the sale and distribution of water? There is a part of this legislation that also talks about the supply. So if I have collected some water and I put a pipe into my neighbor's garden so that they too can benefit from the fact that I have a tank that collects rainwater, am I in breach of the law? Because I'm supplying and I don't have a permit. So, I mean, some of these things that may affect, it may seem like a little issue, but if someone is infringing the law, it would be helpful for them to know that if you are collecting water in this way at home, it is for you. You are not supposed to be supplying it to the rest of the village or the district or anything of the sort, at least according to this legislation, unless you have a permit. So if you have a community garden that is just on the lot next door to you, you shouldn't really be using as far as I understand, your resources at home that you are collecting, whatever, whether it is from your washing machine or you collect rainwater to supply others. So, Mr. President, I'm being very brief here. I would want to reiterate my concern that we have more time to assess legislation, especially legislation as important as this. It really is important. We've heard here already how critical water is to all of our lives, how important this matter is to Barbados because of the scarcity. I have some little concerns about the health and safety elements that Senator Dr. Brathwaite raised, as well as Senator Dr. Haynes. We wouldn't want to be, even in our own activities at home, doing things that then cause illness unintentionally because we think that we are helping to conserve water. We are doing something that is good. So these are things that I think need a fuller treatment and more time for those of us who are privileged to be in this place to ruminate on, as well as, I would say, those, when this bill, one assumes, is enacted and becomes legislation, for the public to have an understanding of as well. In particular, those people who are going to see this as an opportunity to do some things at home. We would want to, if people are paying attention in this way, but we would want to ensure that they are doing so safely. Mr. President, those are my few words, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. No more speakers, Senator Cummins. Senator Dr. Morrow-Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me first start by thanking all of the members in this honourable chamber for their contributions. I believe that we've had a thoughtful discussion around this bill, and I take note of the sentiments in respect of the fact that the honourable chamber did have a short period of time for this amended version of the bill. And I do want to thank everyone again for rising to the occasion and for the contributions that were made. I do as well want to recognize all of the various government departments, entities, and ministers that would have worked assiduously in putting together the water reuse bill. This is no mean feat. As I would have said, Mr. President, this has been on the order paper for some time. There have been various iterations of it, and one of the reasons why it was not brought previously was, again, the need to make sure that there was careful consideration of the elements. And in particular, Mr. President, I want to identify the Deputy Prime Minister, the Honourable Santia Bradshaw, and all of her officials that would have been working assiduously for the Barbados Water Authority in terms of making the critical input I want to as well recognize the Ministry of Environment, particularly EPD as well, which would have led the initial framework for the water reuse bill. And then, of course, the Ministry of Health, Senator Dr. Jerome Walker, who isn't here with us as he's on travel duty as well, also making critical inputs. So as I said, Mr. President, this has been a work in progress that we're working on cross-sectorally, and of course as well the AG's chambers, and very critical in terms of, again, working through all of the various ministries, different iterations to make sure that we had a bill that we could now reach to this particular point before us, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to start by saying to Senator Malalu that I was in no way diminishing or trivializing his comments. But I do recognize, and I hope that we would recognize, that this honourable chamber is one in which people pay attention to. And therefore, the extent to which we are able to make sure that we carefully craft and nuance the information and the sense that we are providing is extremely important, and it was therefore critical for me to be able to indicate that we needed to make sure that we nuance the conversation sufficiently, Mr. President. I also want to note Senator Malalu's caution to us in relation to overregulation, and I note as well that Senator Hayward said, we really needed to have a balance in terms of overregulation and underregulation, and that is important because the issue is important. The impact, the consequences is important, and how we are able then to have a process that is sufficiently nimble, flexible, and responsive, but also as well pay attention to the critical issues of health, as we would have heard again from Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite, and those implications is something that we have to be able to balance. And therefore, Mr. President, and as was also indicated as well by Senator Dr. Crystal Haynes, we will look forward then to making sure that as the regulations roll out, that then we can see the balance of the measures that would be in place to provide for the operationalization of this bill, striking that perfect balance that is needed. I want, Mr. President, in response to Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite, and Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite took us to page 21, section 24D. And there he cautioned us in respect of the uses of black water, and he indicated to us his concern in relation to the potential for health consequences. And my only response would be to say this is the reason why that this act is under the administration of the Ministry of Health, because there is that significant recognition that of the implications, of the health implications. And we are seeking in the context of placing the administration of that, one, to signal to the society that we understand those implications and challenges, but as you said, that understand the Ministry of Health is therefore best placed to put the mitigation framework in place to address those challenges if they should arise. I also want, Mr. President, to respond to page 22, at page 2226.1. Again, Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite pointed us to at section 26D, and he was asking in relation to what is the difference between a contravention and an offence, because at page 24 you had an offence, at page 26, sorry, at section 26 we're now talking about administrative penalties for a contravention. And Mr. President, you can think of it in the context of minor and major incidences. If you look at 24, again, where we are talking about offence, 24, if you would recall, Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite, through you, Mr. President, is really when we are talking about people using the permit in ways that will have direct public health consequences, right? So, for instance, if you are using a person who without a wastewater treatment permit sells or otherwise supplies reclaimed water, so that if it is you don't have a permit, it means that you are not being inspected, etc. That has grave implications, right? So that's a major offense, and that is why it is noted there. On the other hand, at 24, when we're talking about administrative now, that again is what you would call a minor offense, and that is why we're talking now, not necessarily in terms of an offense per se, but really in terms of a contravention, Mr. President. And I want as well to respond to Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite in his indication that there was a concern that in the payment of the penalty applied under Section 21, under 21D again, that it says that it will be paid, I'm sorry? 26, sorry, I apologize, Mr. President. 26. A person who is in receipt of an administrative penalty notice shall pay the amount of the penalty to the minister. Mr. President, the term minister here, as in other legislation, refers to the office and not to the person. We will note, Mr. President, that at Section 4, it indicates that the administration of the act, that the minister is responsible for the administration of this act. So the minister and the office of the minister, and if you look at other legislation, whether it is the Postmaster General, whether it is the Controller of Customs, if they are the person who has the responsibility for administering the act, the penalties and fees are paid to the office of that person. And so in this regard, it speaks to the office of the minister, who under the Act at 4 is responsible for the administration of this Act. And again, the regulations will speak to a number of the questions that Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite raised in respect of understanding how receipts and redress, etc., will be handled within the context of the payment of this penalty, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wanted to as well speak to the concerns of Senator Dr. Christopher Maynard, and he was talking about the notion of energy in particular, and how we integrate energy and energy efficiency within the context of this notion of water reuse. And this, Mr. President, I want to say is something that we need to consider, and thank Senator Maynard for raising it because it is extremely critical. It allows us to think about the nuance, not just in terms of the water reuse, but also, again, like we were speaking about before, how do we kind of make sure that there is coherence in terms of our policy framework. So if we're talking about water reuse, then we also need to talk about the energy that is needed to be able to generate the process. And I do want to advise that there has been quite a bit of thinking about this as well. Already opportunities are being explored for the generation of the energy from the wastewater, specifically focused on anaerobic decomposition as one of the methods, or an integration of the solid components into incineration as well. We're also exploring, Mr. President, moving the power usage to a renewable energy base as well through the use of solar PV. And so that there has been some thinking, Mr. President, in respect of how we treat to the energy that needs to be able to go into the process, but also on the reverse side, that can also be harvested as well. I want to also as well thank Dr. Crystal Haynes for her contribution, and again, reinforcing the necessity for us to be able to make sure that we have a strong regulatory framework, and as well to make sure that we keep at the forefront those health considerations. And I want to indicate, Mr. President, all wastewater wastewater will be treated to the required standard. When I was speaking before, I would have indicated that we would have signed on to some specific protocols that establish standards for us to be able to use resources such as these. So even though we're talking about wastewater, all of the wastewater will be treated to a particular standard. And of course, what the legislation does is provide a framework for us to be able to monitor. And again, reiterating, this is exactly why the administration of this bill is within the context of the Ministry of Health and Wellness as well. In relation to Senator Hewitt's contribution, and I want to thank him thank him very much for the opportunities that he identified in relation to this bill and in relation to the water reuse sector. One of the challenges, Mr. President, that we have, again, is the involvement of the private sector. Yeah? And it is something, again, not just for Barbados, but certainly I've been involved in other conversations around the fact that we need to be able to find ways to incentivize the private sector to take hold of these opportunities, to see them as commercial opportunities as well, and that it can then spur other activities. Unfortunately for the private sector, again, particularly here in Barbados, because of the small market size, they don't necessarily see opportunities like these in the context of being able to have the wide profit margin that might be expected. But there are already areas where we are working with the private sector in terms of public-private partnerships in order as well to be able to foster their involvement, which is extremely critical as well. Mr. President, I want to say that in respect to Senator Dr. Christina Hines, that I fully understand and appreciate that there are questions that need to be answered, Mr. President. And two things. One, the intent in the context of this discussion about water reuse must be accompanied by a large strategic communications plan. And that is recognized, and the consultants have already been hired in order to be able to do so. The importance of this, Mr. President, we are not missing it. We're not missing it. But at the same time, we're not missing the fact that we need to bring the population along. Just as Senator Hayward reminded us that we need to make sure that the population understands the need to conserve, we understand that we need to bring the population into this strategy, into understand the importance of water reuse, into being able to understand what constitutes something that falls within the ambit of this particular bill and something that might be for personal use. And we are intended, Mr. President, to be able to do that, to make sure that that is comprehensive. And I want to say as well that it is not just for external stakeholders. When I say that, external to government, public, etc. But that communications plan also has to extend to internal stakeholders as well. This is something that the government as a whole has to be able to grapple with and has to be able to understand so that there will be ongoing conversations. I remember, Mr. President, when we were doing the regulations for the Barbados Medicinal Cannabis Licensing Authority, that those regulations are provided for us to continue to have conversations with experts, continued for us to have conversations with various stakeholders. They were not done in a vacuum. And we are making, as a government, Mr. President, a commitment to continuing to have that engagement in terms of the communications, but also as well as we roll out the regulations. Because again, as Senator Dr. Christina Hines identified, this has serious implications for health, etc., as we've all discussed. So this is not something that we can take lightly within that context as well. I also wanted to respond again to some of the other questions that Senator Dr. Christina Hines raised, just in terms of the differences between the previous version that was shared in March and the version that we would have had no. Mr. President, as I said, this bill has gone through various iterations, and and that is a result of the conversations that has been happening across ministries, yeah? And so we could have brought that earlier version that had all of the schedules, but then that would not have allowed for the continuation of the conversations that need to have at the technical level in the context of developing the regulations to determine what is the best kind of fees or fines that need to be applied, etc. So while we started there in that conversation about we can define the schedules, we're at the point of saying, let's, in the context of the regulations, allow for greater ventilation and then be able to see those areas be further elaborated. I also wanted to say as well that we started the conversation in which the Ministry of the Environment was leading, and that is a substantive change as well, seen to lead the process. But again, the conversations led us to the realization that this would perhaps be best placed within the context of the Ministry of Health, certainly, again, because of all that we've discussed here in terms of the health implications. So there have been some substantive changes, Mr. President, but we believe that those substantive changes rebound to the benefit of the strength of the bill before us, and again, will allow us to continue to be able to elaborate on the bill. Mr. President, I do beg that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I rise to advise that in the absence of the Deputy President, it is necessary for us to appoint a temporary Deputy President who can serve in the role of Chair of Committees. On that basis, I wish to recommend that Senator the Honourable Lindell Nurse be appointed as temporary Deputy President to serve as Chairman of Committee.
Are there any further nominations? In the absence thereof, Senator the Honourable Linda Nurse, you are hereby appointed as temporary Deputy President of the Senate. Thank you for agreeing to serve. Senator Cummings. Senator Dr. Maria Knight.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honour do not leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself to committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Senate is in committee.
Take the bill in parts.
Permission granted.
Part 1, clauses 1 through 4.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 1, clauses 1 to 4 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 1, clauses 1 to 4 stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 2, clauses 5 to 7.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move that Part 2, clauses 5 to 7 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 2, clauses 5 to 7 do stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 3, clauses 8 to 12.
Mr. Chair, I beg that Part 3, clauses 8 to 12 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 3, clauses 8 to 12 stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 4, clauses 13 to 15.
Mr. Chair, I beg that Part 4, clauses 13 to 15 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 4, clauses 13 to 15 do stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clauses 16 to 21.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that Part 5, clauses 16 to 21 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 5, clauses 16 to 21 do stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Part 6, clauses 22 to 28.
Mr. Chair, I beg that Part 6, clauses 22 to 24, to 28 to 28 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 6, clauses 22 to 28 stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The schedule.
Mr. Chair, I beg that the schedule be the schedule to the bill.
The question is that the schedule be the schedule to the bill, to the act. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chair, I beg that you report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Dr. Moroni.
Mr. President, I beg to move the passing, that this bill be now read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be now passed and be cited as the Water Reuse Act 2023.
The question is that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Water Reuse Act 2023. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. This bill is therefore passed and so cited. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much. I know each time I stand, I have occasion to say thank you to the honourable members of the Senate. Mr. President, we have some.
We recommit private members' business.
Private members' business. Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to move to give notice of a resolution, private members' resolution. Whereas, by proclamation dated 26 October 2020, Parliament was empowered to meet from 27 October 2020 with some members present in the chambers and others participating virtually for sundry reasons which necessitated amendments to the standing orders of the Honourable House of Assembly in particular. And whereas, at the commencement of the 2022 to 2027 session of Parliament, the House of Assembly adopted the standing orders of the previous session. And whereas it is desirable that the Senate should meet in the aforesaid hybrid format, thereby necessitating amendments to the standing orders. And whereas, in accordance with Standing Order 60 of the Honourable the Senate, this matter should be referred to the Standing Orders Committee for its consideration. Be it resolved that this House empower the Standing Orders Committee to consider the said amendments.
Closure of public business.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I do want to, on this occasion in particular, given the very last item which was on the order paper, which only came down from the other place overnight, to express the absolute appreciation of the government of Barbados to every member of this honourable chamber for their support and their collaboration today on each of these bills, but in particular, the very last bill on the water reuse. And it is again a commitment of the persons who have agreed to serve in this chamber that we come, we show up, we represent, even sometimes in less than ideal timelines than we would want, but we are always engaged and willing to put our best foot forward. I would be surprised, Mr. President, if many persons could, with very little time on their hands, have an opportunity, as was the case just now with Senator Dr. Christina Hines, identify the differences between a March bill and a May bill. So I commend you for always giving the Senate of your best. And so with these words, again, to thank everyone, the government side, the independent side, I beg to move that with the conclusion of government business for the day, that the Senate be adjourned sine die.
The question is that the Senate do now adjourn sine die. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senate therefore now stands adjourned sine die.